When the Prophet brought the teaching of Islam, he brought a teaching of equality, where the rich and poor were now equal. Men and women had an equal status in society.
He was telling the world two things. One was how to treat daughters with respect and how to respect women in general. And also the fact that in times to come, he will be indebted to Fatima and her progeny for the propagation and survival of his divine message. The message of love, of equality, of justice, of peace, not a message of what Islam has now is interpreted to be.
At a very young age, she accomplished so much. In 18 years of life, we find that she leaves a legacy like none other. She is one woman who is the axis between both imamat and nabuwat.
To have someone like Fatima Zahra is a treasure. It's really something that, instead of having it only in books and words, and you should be like this, and you should aspire to be so, when you actually see a person becoming like that, it really encourages you and tells you that this is possible. It's possible to be generous like Fatima. It's possible to be wise like Fatima. It's possible to be firm in faith like Fatima.
O people, know that I am Fatima, and my father is Muhammad. I will say that repeatedly and continuously. I do not say what I am saying mistakenly, nor do I do what I do aimlessly. A messenger has come to you from among yourselves. So if you know him and you know who he is, you will see that he is my father, not the father of any of your women.
Fatima alayhi salam was brought up by her father, the master of all creation. He fed her with his talents and mentality. He taught her the Quran and all things about the verses of verdicts, the causes of the revelation of verses, and other things concerning the Quran. He educated her the rulings of the Sharia, the nobilities of character, and high morals and principles. He upbrought her on the sincere faith in Allah, the creator of the universe and giver of life.
Lady Fatima was born 5 years after the revelation of Islam. And when she was born, people made fun of the Prophet because, of course, they are coming from a society where having a daughter was a shame. They said to the Prophet that your lineage will be cut off. You don't have a son. Who will carry your family name?
They would call him Abtar, which meant tailless, because his son had died in infancy. And they then said that consequently he would be Abtar, tailless, meaning that he would have no one to continue on his lineage.
No sons. He will die, and he will die alone. Nobody will continue his line. And so the Quran, a whole chapter was dedicated to refuting this. we have given you, we have promised you and will give you the abundance. And the meaning of abundance is several here. So say to your enemy, or tell your enemy, that he is al-Abtar.
Kauthar, we believe, is Fatima al-Zahra because the lineage of the Prophet was carried on through Lady Fatima.
And it wouldn't only be the fact that she would give birth to Imam Hassan and Imam Husayn in terms of the men of her house, but everybody that is then called a Sayyid. So her progeny is still being built from today.
And we see, after 1400 years, there are people amongst us now that we say they are descendants of the Prophet. We look at the history of the people who are children and grandchildren of the Prophet, and we know their names, we know their life stories, we know where their shrines are, we go and visit them. But who do we know from the sons of Abu Lahab or Abu Jahl or Abu Sufyan? We don't trace their line.
And we find that even in the hadith, we find that there are hadiths that says, may Allah have mercy on our Shi'as because they are made from our excess tinat. And consequently, everybody then who is a Shi'a is considered to be of the Al because we are made from that excess tinat. And therefore her lineage then continues.
And so the Prophet faced each of these tribulations with magnanimity, with utmost patience. And Fatima al-Zahra learned from him this. And in later life, when she was faced with tribulations, she would respond in exactly the same way the Prophet did.
Rasulullah used to treat Fatima in a manner which was different to the manner he used to treat other children.
The Holy Prophet behaved with Fatima in such a way that everybody was astounded. He took the child in his lap. He would kiss her on a daily basis on her head. He would hold her hand and walk with her. He would sit and talk with her.
The Prophet would love Fatima al-Zahra. When he would walk into a room, she would stand for him and seat him in her place. And likewise, when she would walk inside a room, the Prophet would stand. He would embrace her. He would kiss her, and then he would seat her where he is sitting.
What has gotten into this man? How does he behave like this with a young child? 2 or 3 or 4 years old, we pay no attention to them. Yet look what this man has done.
For Rasulullah, Fatima al-Zahra was the most beloved of creations. We have narrations from the 5th and the 6th Imam that says that Rasulullah would never retire for a day without having kissed Sayyidah Fatima al-Zahra first.
It is said that when he would leave Medina, he would see Fatima last, and when he would come back, she was the first person that he would go and see.
Men of Quraysh had never seen behavior like this. They wouldn't talk to their daughters. The Quran says that they would bury their daughters and be angry at the birth of daughters. They saw no value in them. Some of them traded away their daughters. Some of them openly tried to kill their daughters. And when they saw the Holy Prophet behaving in this way, they were surprised.
And for a man at that time to do that to his daughter was surely a bewildering thing.
He was telling the world two things. One was how to treat daughters with respect, and how to respect women in general, and also the fact that in times to come, he will be indebted to Fatima and her progeny for the propagation and survival of his divine message. The message of love, of equality, of justice, of peace, and not a message of what Islam has now is interpreted to be.
You need to behave in the right way because this young child today will be the mother of tomorrow. This young child today will be the wife of tomorrow. This young child today will be the supporter and the maker of society tomorrow. If we mistreat her today, we suffer tomorrow. And this was a message that the Prophet was struggling to get out because the tide was very strong, not just in Arabia, elsewhere in the world. And yet in that time, the Prophet was preaching a message of humanity that people found surprising. And so in this environment Fatima al-Zahra was born into, she would see her father leave every day to preach his message.
She witnesses a lot of hostility by the infidels of Arabia, a lot of hostility towards Rasulullah because obviously he was now bringing a religion that was directly against what they believed and directly against their norms and practices. And we hear of one incident when he was reciting the Quran in one of the chambers at the Kaaba, and they or he was in sujood, and they take a camel's placenta and they drop it on his head.
But she was the one that would wipe away the blood, that would take away the intestines from his back, that would look after him. And that is why the Prophet said, Fatima, anti Am-o-Abiha. Fatima, you are the mother of your father.
Fatima took the role of her mother towards her father, who still faced the harms and aggressions of Quraysh. Fatima comforted the loneliness of her father and relieved his sufferings, and served him with her love and kindness until she was called the mother of her father.
So Fatima grew up in a life of jihad. This is jihad. The jihad that we talk about isn't attacking the weak. The jihad is facing those who are stronger than you. Standing up to those who would bully their way. That is jihad. Standing up for those who are oppressed. And this is what the Prophet was doing. He took into Islam all the people who were being oppressed by the non-Muslims. Slaves, women, people who were without tribal protection, people who were oppressed just because they said La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah.
She came into this world to suffer for the salvation of human beings. And that from the whole childhood right to the age when she achieved her martyrdom. This lady, this noble lady, Salamullah alayha, she endured suffering and endured it with patience. Not necessarily at the hands of the people, also the circumstances were such.
Fatima was so dear, in fact, and as a result of that, the name of Fatima is so dear now that we are told that anybody who names their daughter Fatima, they are told to refrain from scolding her, and because the name has such a respect put behind it. Fatima as a person, we find that we are told that anybody who angers Fatima angers Allah, and her happiness is in line with Allah's happiness. And as a result of that, we find that her status, both as a daughter and as a woman, is highly elevated as a result.
And so Fatima grew up in this environment where she saw the Prophet's courage. How courageous the Prophet was. Even in such difficult circumstances, he didn't let go of the Risalah. He would not stop preaching to people. She saw the Prophet's jihad, how difficult for him to see himself, his family, his wife, his daughter, his cousins all suffer because of his preaching. And yet the Prophet would not stop. She saw his kindness, his akhlaq. She saw the way he tried to protect his family and his fellow Muslims. She saw the best characteristics of a man. And she wanted to emulate the Prophet in this way. And she wanted to teach later on her children and her neighbors and her friends some of the akhlaq of the Prophet.
All these tribulations and trials that the Rasulullah went through, so did his family. And the person who stood, apart from Imam Ali, who was his student at the time, and also his cousin, because he had taken him under his wings, was his wife Khadija and Abu-Talib. They stood by him all the while.
We find that during the life of Rasulullah, as time went on, the resistance that he faced from the Quraysh didn't let up in any way whatsoever.
And the Prophet's protector, Abu-Talib, his uncle, decided to take them out of Mecca temporarily until the situation improved. They went to a place called Abu-Talib.
That was a valley outside Mecca where Abu-Talib had taken his household after they had been boycotted by the Meccan society.
And still accessible to Mecca. So the Prophet still could go out and preach to people, not completely in seclusion, but protected from people's attacks.
However, as a result of this, we also find that they are then put under stern economic sanctions.
They decided they would not trade with them, nor buy or sell anything to, nor talk to them, nor marry from them, nor live next to, nor allow to use any of their lands or their paths or any of their belongings. They formed a blockade of the Banu Hashim, and so they were forced out of Mecca. A memorandum was drawn up and it was hung on the Kaaba.
The question I ask is, the Muslims were there. There were some Muslims around. They were living in Mecca. Did they come to help? The companions? Did they come to help Rasulullah?
And in that time, Abu-Talib would send them food, and they would use the wealth of Khadija to provide for them at that time.
And why? How does Abu-Talib has the courage to go into to Mecca, get food? Everybody knew where he was taking the food, for what purpose he was taking the food. He was the only person who shows courage. And so does his son Ali later on. Where have the companions gone? There was nobody there who volunteered to say, okay, Abu-Talib, I'm going to do that, you stay where you are. Nobody does that. The history records only he, and he alone, did that.
The cries of the children would reach the inhabitants of Mecca, and this situation lasted for, we're told, 3 years.
And Fatima az-Zahra lived through this. She saw her father risking his life on a daily basis, coming down from the caves and going into Mecca, sometimes with one or two of his companions, sometimes with Aqil and Ali ibn Abi Talib, and Hamza, his uncle, going out, and even though the crowds were against him, some of them, he would preach to them on a daily basis.
So we find that after the event of Shayba Abu-Talib, we enter into the year of grief, because Rasulullah loses two of his main hold supporters.
At the time, Lady Khadija is seen crying, and Asma bint Umayyah says to Khadija that you are the wife of the Prophet, the first one to have believed in him. You are the first woman of Islam. Why are you crying? And Khadija replies, Asma, surely I'm not crying for myself. I'm crying for my daughter Fatima az-Zahra.
She says that when a daughter gets married, she needs her mother there for advice. And she goes, my passing is inevitable, however, who will be there for Fatima?
So Asma bint Umayyah says, I promise you that the day that Fatima az-Zahra gets married, I will go with her in your place. I will be her mother on that day, and I will be the one that she tells. And Khadija then smiled.
Diseases attacked the mother of believers, Khadija, and death approached her soon. In the last moments of her life, she felt pain whenever she looked at her only daughter Fatima, who was a young child then. She looked at Fatima with pain and sigh, and she recommended the Prophet ﷺ to take much care of her. The Prophet ﷺ was afflicted by the great loss of Khadija, who filled his life with satisfaction and tranquility, and relieved him from the persecution of the oppressors of Quraysh. He was very sad when she died. He washed, enshrouded, and offered the prayer on her. He dug a grave for her and buried her in it. The loss of Khadija caused the Prophet a great sorrow, until he called that year in which Abu-Talib had too died, the year of sorrow.
And yet, at the age of 8 years old, she was faced with possibly the biggest calamity of her young life, the loss of her mother Khadija. Her mother had died, leaving Fatima az-Zahra orphaned at a young age of 8 years old, without a mother, without a protector in her household, was very difficult for her.
When Khadija dies, the Prophet is grieved. He weeps. He buries Khadija, and he weeps over her loss. And it is said that years after Khadija died, whenever the name Khadija was mentioned, the Prophet would start crying.
And in that same year, we find that he loses Abu-Talib. And Abu-Talib had adopted him at a very young age because of his father had passed away and his mother had passed away. And Abu-Talib had adopted him when he was 8 years old upon the death of his grandfather Abdul-Muttalib. And so therefore Abu-Talib was the Prophet's guardian until he had reached 53 years of age.
With these two persons no longer there, Jibreel appeared to Rasulullah and said, your protector has passed away, you leave Mecca.
And it is not safe for you in Mecca anymore. The Quraysh are plotting against you.
These tribes came together and they said, we will kill him. And we will take one person from each one of these tribes so that no one will be held accountable for his death.
And so the Prophet decided to leave Mecca. He was told by Jibreel, tonight they will attack your house. So find somebody of you, somebody like you, to stay in your place and leave.
He asked Imam Ali alayhi salam to sleep in his bed. And of course, this is a very scary thing because they did not know what would happen to Imam Ali. Imam Ali says to the Prophet that, is this what you want? Will this make Allah happy?
Will my sleeping on your bed preserve your life? And Rasulullah said, yes, God has assured me that I will be safe. Imam Ali said that was the best thing I could hear from my mentor and my brother.
What this incident not only shows is the relationship between Rasul and Amir al-Mu'min, but also how much trust there was, because Rasulullah entrusts his daughter to Amir al-Mu'minin. She was still there. She was still in the house. And so once Rasulullah had arrived in Medina, we hear that Amir al-Mu'minin leaves with Fatima bint Asad, and he leaves his mother, and he leaves with Fatima Zahra, and they then make their way towards Medina.
And so Fatima sallallahu alayha was one of the people who committed the hijrah, who left from Mecca to Medina on emigration, who took flight to seek safety elsewhere. And the Prophet waited for them before they entered Medina and entered together to the welcoming of the people.
The people of Medina were glorious. They were so joyful. They stood in lines awaiting the Prophet, and when they saw his camel, they started reciting the famous Tala al-Badr, "Oh, the wise moon that has rised over us." They were brilliantly excited. They were fighting over where the Prophet would stay. One would say, he should stay with me. Another would say, no, he should stay with me. And of course, the Prophet stayed where his camel stopped.
There, Rasulullah began building the society that Abu Nasr al-Farabi refers to as Madinatul Fadilah. He began to implement the system of justice and order which was divinely decreed by God to him.
And Fatima Zahra, for the first few days of her life, found herself a stranger amongst the people and found herself a force for education. Though she was 8 years old at the time, the people of Medina, most of them were new to Islam. And she found herself helping the Prophet in spreading the message.
She began to teach all that her father had taught her, i.e., the grammar, the Arabic grammar and language, theology and philosophy as a part of theology, and ethics as a part of religion, of how we should treat our fellow human beings.
And so from the young age, she took upon herself in Medina after the Hijrah to teach people the basic tenets of faith, to explain to people what the Quran meant in these verses, what the Prophet wanted them to do, how Islam is made up of, what beliefs must you have, and how do you come to these beliefs. And even though the following years were very difficult, Fatima Zahra found herself in the shoes of her father, representing her father and representing Islam.
There's a narration once that a woman comes to her and she asked her numerous questions, and she apologizes, and Fatima Zahra said, surely I do not tire, because Allah is giving me my reward for answering your questions.
In that society, the importance of neighbor, irrespective of who your neighbor was, whether he was a believer or a non-believer, a Jewish or Christian or believer in one God or many gods, if he was your neighbor, you were duty bound to care for him. And if your neighbor went to sleep hungry, you were not a believer in Islam. That was what the hadith of Rasulullah was. He whose neighbor goes to bed hungry is not a believer in God and is not a Muslim.
The Prophet, at the beginning of his move to Medina, was faced with a lot of questions. He had to deal with some of the tribes that were allied with the Quraysh, who were willing to kill Muhammad at any time. He had to deal with the Jews of Medina, who were looking for a prophet, but when they were told that he was Muhammad, they decided to say, no, not this kind of prophet. We don't want Muhammad. He had to deal with the old Arab customs. He had to deal with the friction of the emigrants, al-Muhajirun, and the people of Medina themselves, al-Ansar. So Fatima Zahra had a role in spreading the message herself.
Even though Rasulullah now is in Medina, we find that Islam now is becoming stronger, because people now have a place to pray freely. People now learning from Rasulullah and his daughter.
When more and more, the greater amount of knowledge was spread among women and men, there was obviously greater wisdom, greater understanding, and consequently a more peaceful atmosphere prevailed in the city. And that became eventually an envy a source of envy to Quraysh, because they thought after evicting him from Mecca, Muhammad's base, his ancestral base, has been destroyed. He will never ever be able to establish himself anywhere.
1 year after the Prophet's immigration to Medina, the infidels mobilized their men and headed towards the Muslim stronghold, intending to destroy the new faith. But Gabriel informed the Prophet of their conspiracy, who in return ordered the immigrants and Medinites to leave the city and meet them in a place located on the way to Mecca called Badr. Although the infidels outnumbered the Muslims 3-1, the Prophet and his followers defeated them and returned to Medina triumphant and victorious.
And though Fatima al-Zahra saw now directly how dangerous the message was for the Prophet, how dangerous the role of a Prophet was, that the Prophet was being challenged physically now, not just by people throwing stones and people making a mockery of him and people sometimes insulting. No, now people were willing to go to war and kill hundreds of people to get to the Prophet. And so Fatima found herself in Medina while the Prophet was out in Badr.
When the men would go to battle, Fatima al-Zahra would be the one to visit the ladies, visit those whose husbands had gone to battle. She would visit them. She would make sure they're okay. She would help them within their household. She is known to carry water for people. She would sweep their houses. Those people that weren't able to provide for themselves, she would cook for them. She would help them.
And Fatima found herself keeping up the spirits of the people, telling people that this was real jihad, that the Prophet would succeed, that the Prophet was supported by Allah. And though some of the people in Medina were hypocrites and some people were spreading doubt, Fatima al-Zahra would tell people, turn to prayer, turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Let us read what the words of the Quran are. Tell us how many times the Quran in one of the verses says, how many times has it been a smaller force has defeated the larger force.
The year following, they came back with vengeance, with a bigger army. This time they were joined by Abu Sufyan with his own tribe, and they came to avenge Badr. There was a raised ground on which Rasulullah stood, and he instructed 70 of his followers not to move.
Those that were on the mountain pass were witnessing the war that happened, the battle that was happening down below, and it came to a point where it seemed that the Muslims had won this war because there was the collection of booty that was happening, and Khalid ibn Walid was now fleeing the battlefield. Because of the gathering of booty, those that were on this mountain pass, having witnessed this, assumed that the war was over and started to dismount themselves. Even though they were instructed to not dismount, they dismounted, and because they were dismounted, Khalid bin Walid saw this happening, regrouped his troops together, and then ambushed the Muslims from behind.
And in which Hamza bin Ahlulbayt was killed, and after his body mutilated in a most horrible way. And the Prophet himself was struck by sword, by arrow, by rocks, by shields, so that he was bleeding from his forehead and from his mouth. And it is said, narrations say, a voice cried out, "Qutila Muhammad." Muhammad has been killed. And in that difficult battle, everybody fled.
The Muslim men started to run away thinking, oh, the Prophet's died. Now, we don't have any uphold. What are we going to do? Only handful of truthful Muslims stayed behind with the Prophet.
And Ali would fight until his sword broke. And the Prophet took his sword and gave it to Amir al-Mu'mineen. And Amir al-Mu'mineen would strike and fight and defeated all the champions of Quraysh until a voice was heard in the heavens, La fata illa Ali, la sayf illa dhul faqar, which was the sword of the Holy Prophet.
News had reached Medina to say that Rasulullah had passed away. And so Fatima al-Zahra with Safiya, the aunt of the Prophet, and together with some other women made their way to the fields of Uhud. When they got there, Rasulullah was in fact alive. Imam Ali brought some water in his shield, so that Sayyidah Fatima al-Zahra was able to clean the wounds of her father.
She burnt a corner of the mat on which Rasulullah was sitting and used the ash to stop the blood flowing from his gums. And that's how she gave him the medical first aid, if you like, on the spot. And she then took him, after the battle, she took him back to Medina.
As a result of Hamza's death in Uhud, we find that Hamza became known as Sayyid al-Shuhada. And he was known as that until the Battle of Karbala took place, and Imam al-Husayn was then known as Sayyid al-Shuhada.
And at that time, the Prophet was grieved, and he told Khadija and the women of his family to mourn his uncle Hamza.
Abdul Muttalib's daughter was the one who led the majlis, if you like. And in her home, the Ansar performed the first majlis which the Shias are accused of performing in commemorating the martyrdom of Karbala, of al-Husayn at Karbala. That was the first majlis that took place in Medina, in the lifetime of Rasulullah, on his instructions.
And so we see that the life of Fatima isn't one of only somebody who awaits results, is sat at home waiting for direction. She herself has initiative. When the people say that Muhammad is being killed, she comes out to the battle to see what has happened, to tend to her father. She is leading from the front, as we say. You would expect most women in that time to start crying, to maybe lose their faith, to do all sorts of things. But instead, Fatima carries herself well, has strength and conviction to go out and tend to the Prophet. What a difficult circumstance, yet how well has she behaved in that situation.
Having brought her father safely back to the city of Medina, Fatima Salamullah alayha went back with her normal life of lecturing and teaching during the daytime and looking after her household in the evenings and at night, and never neglecting her remembrance of God and her prayer. And her supplications became well known. People used to come and ask her for help, and she would advise them what to supplicate and how to recite the prayer and at what time of the day they should do so.